In a dusty corner of a quiet town, a struggling mechanic stooped to pick up a stranger's groceries, not knowing that simple act of kindness would change his entire world. She walked away with torn paper bags and left behind the spark of something much deeper. He fixed cars. She fixed lives. What they didn't realize was that fate had just dropped the heaviest thing of all, a second chance at love. This is the story of how one broken bag led to a brand new beginning. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The morning sun crept over the rusted rooftops of Whitlow, Tennessee, casting long orange streaks through the garage windows as Jake Carter wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned back from the hood of an old Chevy. His knuckles were raw, his flannel sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms smudged in grease and grit. The engine still refused to turn over. He muttered something under his breath and slammed the hood shut a little harder than necessary. In the distance, a school bus groaned around the corner, tires hissing on the cracked pavement. Jake glanced at the clock, 7:43 a.m., and dropped the wrench on the workbench. He tore off his gloves, grabbed his jacket, and jogged toward the trailer out back where the porch light still flickered, even in daylight. Inside, 8-year-old Lila was hunched over the kitchen table, her tiny hands clutching a peanut butter sandwich in a plastic bag. Her backpack sagged on the floor beside her. "Did you brush your hair?" Jake asked, his voice gruff but warm. Lila shrugged. "Kinda." He crouched beside her and gently tugged the comb through her tangled curls, his fingers careful not to pull too hard. The same curls her mother used to tame with a pink ribbon. His chest tightened. "You gotta take care of yourself, kiddo," he said softly. "I'm trying," she whispered. She didn't mean her hair. They rode in silence to the bus stop in Jake's sputtering pickup, the heat barely working and the defrost doing little against the frost webs crawling up the windshield. When the bus finally rumbled up, Lila turned to him before climbing out. "Do you think Mama would have liked my picture?" she asked, holding up a wrinkled drawing of a flower and a smiling stick figure labeled "Me." Jake swallowed hard, his voice stuck somewhere between grief and guilt. "She would have framed it," he said. After she climbed aboard, Jake watched the bus disappear into the morning mist, then slumped back into the driver's seat. The bills in the glove compartment were overdue. The garage was 2 weeks behind on rent, and his sister's urn still sat on the top shelf in the closet, wrapped in Lila's baby blanket because he couldn't bring himself to open the box. He started the engine and headed back toward the shop. Another broken alternator waited. Another day of fixing machines while he still didn't know how to fix himself. The parking lot behind Miller's Market was a patchwork of potholes and oil stains, sun-baked and uneven. Jake had just stepped out of the sliding doors, one hand gripping a paper bag filled with instant ramen and engine degreaser, the other fumbling for his keys, when he heard it, a dull thump, followed by the scatter of rolling cans across the asphalt. He looked up just in time to see a woman crouched awkwardly beside her car, frozen mid-reach, as oranges spun out like rogue marbles. Her paper bag had split right down the seam, groceries now sprawled across the lot like the aftermath of a minor disaster. A bottle of olive oil teetered near the storm drain. Jake didn't think. He dropped his bag and jogged over, boots crunching over the cracked pavement. The woman was already trying to scoop up a runaway apple when he reached her, kneeling beside the chaos. "Don't move. That oil's headed for the drain," he said, lunging just in time to catch it. She looked up, startled. Hazel eyes, sharp but tired. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail that was a little too perfect for this side of town, and the long tan coat she wore looked like it had no business here among the rusted-out pickups and bent shopping carts. "Thanks," she muttered, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "I didn't even see the tear, just gave out on me." Jake nodded, already gathering boxes of pasta and dented cans of beans. "Happens more than folks admit. These bags ain't built for real groceries." She gave a soft laugh, more of a breath than a sound, and looked down, cheeks flushed. Still embarrassing? Least you didn't drop eggs, Jake offered. That's the real tragedy. That pulled a smile out of her, just the corner of her mouth. He handed her the last of the cans, and she started refilling a second bag that had mercifully survived. Appreciate it, she said, straightening. Most people would have just stared. Jake stood too, brushing off his jeans, just being neighborly. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but instead, she nodded and opened the car door. Jake turned back to his truck without waiting for a name. He didn't ask for one, didn't expect to see her again. But as he sat in the cab and watched her drive off, the image of her groceries, scattered across the blacktop, stuck in his mind longer than it should have, like a scene from a dream that felt too real to forget. Jake spotted her again 3 days later. It was just after lunch, the sun hanging high but offering little warmth, and he was leaning against the rusted fender of an old Ford in the garage lot, sipping on gas station coffee that tasted like burnt toast and regret. That's when the sleek silver sedan pulled into Miller's Market across the street, same one from the parking lot. He recognized the shimmer of that long coat before he even saw her face. She stepped out, boots clicking softly against the concrete, heels too sharp for gravel and potholes. They looked expensive, those boots. Not flashy, but stitched clean. New leather, real leather, the kind that didn't crack after 2 winters. Her coat hung just right on her shoulders, and when the wind blew, not a single hair moved out of place. She didn't walk like someone from around here. She glided, like the air made room for her. Jake set his coffee on the hood and watched her grab a cart. Her face was neutral, unreadable, but her eyes darted too much, like she was checking the edges of the world for something she'd lost and didn't want anyone to know. There was something distant in the way she moved, like she was walking through fog everyone else couldn't see. She turned toward the garage without warning, catching him mid-stare. Jake didn't flinch, just raised a hand. To his surprise, she crossed the street. "I owe you," she said, voice clear and steady now, even if the faint trace of tension hadn't left her jaw. "The other day, with the groceries." "You don't," he replied simply. She smiled, small and polite. "Still, thank you. I'm Rachel." "Jake," he said, brushing his palms on his jeans. She waited a beat, as if expecting him to ask more, but he didn't. Not where she came from, not what she was doing here, not why she looked like she belonged in a boardroom, not a backroad town where the hardware store closed on Tuesdays. "I'm just passing through," she added finally, almost rehearsed. Jake nodded. "Aren't we all?" They stood in silence for a second too long. Then she offered a quick nod and turned back toward the market, her heels tapping across the road like punctuation marks in a story she wasn't ready to tell. The diner was quiet that night, save for the occasional clatter of silverware and the low hum of old country songs crackling from a jukebox that hadn't worked right since '92. Jake sat in his usual booth back against the wall, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee gone lukewarm. Lila sat across from him, swinging her legs under the table and picking at the edge of her grilled cheese. "She was pretty," Lila said, not looking up. Jake blinked. "Who?" "The grocery lady, the one with the boots." He didn't answer right away. Just took another sip and stared out the window, watching the lights from passing trucks smear across the rain-speckled glass. Lila was always watching, even when he thought she wasn't. "She said her name was Rachel," he said finally. "Just passing through?" Lila tilted her head. "Like Mom was going to do?" Jake's stomach clenched. He set the mug down, slow and careful, and forced a breath through his nose. "Your mom was different. She said we were just stopping here too." He didn't know how to explain that some people don't get to leave when they plan to, that sometimes the world closes in faster than you can pack your bags. Instead, he reached across the table and brushed a crumb from Lila's cheek. "Eat your sandwich," he said gently. Lila nodded, but her eyes stayed on him, searching. She was too young to carry this kind of grief and too smart to ignore it. Later that night, Jake sat on the porch with a blanket draped across his shoulders, the creak of the swing filling the silence as the town drifted off to sleep. The stars were dull behind the clouds. He tried to focus on the sounds of crickets and the smell of engine grease still clinging to his hands, but Rachel's face kept intruding. Those quiet eyes, that half-smile, like she was holding back 1,000 things she'd never say. Just passing through, she'd said. But it felt like something had stopped when she looked at him, like an echo trying to find the wall it used to bounce off. Jake rubbed a hand over his jaw, sighed, and went inside. He told himself it was nothing, just a stranger, nothing more. But sleep didn't come easy that night. The bell above the door jingled just as Jake was wiping his hands on a rag behind the counter. Midday at Dottie's Diner was usually slow, a few regulars scattered across booths, sipping coffee like it was lifeblood. Jake wasn't supposed to be working there, not really, but ever since Lila's aunt took over the morning shifts and needed help fixing the busted grill fan, he'd stop by, tweak a few things, and grab a sandwich before heading back to the garage. He looked up when he heard the bell, expecting some farmer or local contractor covered in dust. Instead, it was her. Rachel stepped inside with that same coat, the one too clean for this town, and the same expression that didn't quite match the room. She scanned the place quickly, eyes calculating, almost wary, before her gaze landed on Jake. Her lips twitched upward into a smile, polite but practiced. "Well," she said, walking toward the counter, "didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Town's not that big," Jake replied, nodding at the stool. "Sit?" She hesitated, then perched gently on the red vinyl seat, folding her hands in front of her like someone used to sitting in meetings, not diners. Jake poured her a coffee without asking. She didn't touch it. "You still just passing through?" he asked, not unkindly. She nodded. "Yeah, just taking a break from everything." He waited. No explanation came, just silence, and that distant look in her eyes again. Not lost exactly, more like someone who'd already found the thing they wanted once and then had to let it go. "You don't seem like the runaway type," Jake said. She raised an eyebrow. "What type do I seem like?" "Someone used to being in charge." Rachel laughed, short and bitter. "Yeah, well, that's the thing about control. Once you lose it, you realize how little of it you ever had." Jake didn't push further. He just leaned on the counter and studied her, quiet and steady. She looked down at her coffee, finally wrapping her hands around the mug. Her nails were manicured but chipped at the edges, like she had been trying to hold it together and just barely missed. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't behind her. It was still tangled up inside. And Jake couldn't explain why, but something about that felt familiar, too familiar. The storm rolled in fast, thick clouds bruising the sky and spitting out rain like it had a score to settle. Jake had just finished grabbing oil filters from Miller's when he saw the flash of headlights trying to turn over in the lot. The car hiccuped once, then fell silent. Another attempt. Nothing but the dry whine of a struggling starter. He squinted through the downpour, droplets clinging to the brim of his cap. The silver sedan. Her again. Rachel sat in the driver's seat, her knuckles white on the wheel, lips pressed tight in frustration. She hit the ignition again. Still nothing. Jake jogged across the parking lot, his boots slapping through puddles. The rain had already soaked through his sleeves. He knocked lightly on her window. Rachel looked over, startled. Her shoulders eased a little when she saw him. "Won't start," she mouthed, cracking the window halfway. "Pop the hood," he said. She did. He ducked in under the latch and stared at the mess of wires and damp plastic with the practiced eye of someone who'd diagnosed 100 cars in worse weather. The starter relay was loose. Cheap rental job, probably hadn't been serviced since it rolled off the lot. Jake reached into his back pocket, pulled out a multi-tool, and got to work, hands trembling slightly from the cold. Rain soaked his collar and trickled down his spine. Rachel stepped out with an umbrella, standing close beside him. Her perfume was faint but warm, something honeyed and soft under the scent of motor oil and wet pavement. "You don't have to do this," she said over the rain. He didn't answer, just worked. A minute later, he slammed the hood down and nodded toward the driver's seat. "Try it now." She climbed in, turned the key. The engine caught with a soft roar. Rachel let out a breath she'd been holding. "You're some kind of magician." Jake shook his head, wiping water from his face. "Just rusty metal and bad luck." She stepped out again, reaching into her purse. "Let me pay you for your time." "No," he said firmly. "Jake." "Rachel," he echoed, just as stubborn. She stared at him, brow furrowed. "Why do you keep helping me?" He shrugged, water dripping from his chin. "'Cause it's raining, and you looked stuck." He turned and walked off before she could argue again, boots squelching through the puddles. He didn't see the way she watched him, her hand still clutching the cash she'd never got to offer, fingers tightening not from frustration but from something else entirely, something she hadn't expected to feel again. The rain hadn't let up, just shifted from angry to tired, falling in a steady drizzle that slicked the pavement and soaked through every thread it touched. Jake leaned against the brick wall under the market's awning, arms crossed, his jacket damp and clinging to his shoulders. Rachel stood beside him, a paper cup of coffee between her hands, steam curling around her face like a veil she didn't know she was wearing. For a while they just stood there, watching the water streak down the windshield of her car. Neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward, just heavy, like they were both waiting for the other to crack it open. "So," Rachel finally said, eyes still on the street, "you always play mechanic in the rain for strangers, or is this a special occasion?" Jake smirked faintly. "I don't mind the rain." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "What's your story, Jake? You've got the look of someone who's seen some things." He let out a breath that was part laugh, part sigh. "Don't know if there's much of a story. Grew up here, never really left. Took over the garage when my old man got too sick to hold a wrench." Rachel shifted. "Family business?" He shook his head. "Just survival." She didn't reply right away, just took a slow sip of her coffee. "I got a niece, Lila. She's 8. Been raising her since my sister passed last year." His voice dipped quieter on the last part, like it didn't want to be heard. "She's the reason I still get up in the morning." That and busted transmissions. Rachel looked over, really looked at him now. Not the grease under his nails or the lines around his eyes, but something deeper, the wear behind the strength. "You sound like a good man," she said softly. Jake shrugged. "I get by." He didn't ask about her, not because he wasn't curious, but because she wore her distance like armor, polished, subtle. Built by years of learning how to speak without saying anything. She asked questions, kept the attention on him, but every time he turned it back she dodged like a pro. She finished her coffee and tossed the cup in the trash, her smile polite but far away. "Well, thanks again," Jake nodded, tipping his cap. "Anytime." She walked back to her car, rain misting around her, heels clicking faintly against the pavement. Jake stayed under the awning, watching her drive off, that old ache pressing behind his ribs again. He wasn't sure what it was about her, what made a stranger feel like someone he already missed. But he knew that whoever she wasn't just passing through anymore, not really. The garage smelled like hot metal and worn-out brakes, the air thick with the tang of engine grease and the sharp hiss of a pneumatic drill. Jake had just crawled out from under a lifted Ford when the bell above the door chimed. He wiped his hands on a dirty rag, half expecting another walk-in customer or one of the parts guys dropping off a late shipment. Instead, it was her, Rachel. She stood in the doorway, her coat draped over one arm, 2 coffees in hand, one of them already missing a few sips. Her hair was pulled back today, a few loose strands framing her face, and for once she didn't look like she was trying so hard to disappear. "I figured you might not take cash," she said, walking toward him, "but maybe you'd take caffeine." Jake blinked, caught off guard in a way that made him feel younger than he was. He reached for the coffee, fingers brushing against hers. warm. "Thanks," he muttered, eyeing her. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she said simply. From the back of the shop, someone whistled low. Kyle, his apprentice, leaned against the wall with a smirk smeared across his face like grease. "Well, damn, boss. You got groupies now." Jake shot him a look, but Rachel just laughed, actually laughed, and the sound of it made something tighten in his chest. It was soft, real, not the practiced version she used in public, and it hit him in a place he didn't know was still open. Lila came barreling in from the office in her muddy sneakers, holding a crumpled piece of paper in her hands. "Uncle Jake, I made a drawing." Jake crouched as she handed it to him proudly. Crayon strokes smeared across printer paper. A big stick figure labeled "Me," a smaller one with a wrench in one hand, and beside him, another figure in a long coat holding a grocery bag. "That's you," Lila said, pointing, "helping the pretty grocery lady." Rachel's cheeks flushed, and Jake just laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Pretty sure that's not what I looked like," he said, holding up the drawing. "She made your arms way too big," Rachel teased. "Hey, I work out," he joked, flexing dramatically and making Lila giggle. For a moment, the garage didn't feel like a place people passed through. It felt like something steady, something that could last. Rachel glanced around, then met his eyes, and this time, finally, she smiled. Not a mask, not a defense. The kind of smile you only give someone who's started to matter. The sun had dipped low behind the trees, casting long, slanted shadows across the concrete as the garage settled into the kind of stillness that only comes after a long day. Most of the crew had already packed up and gone, leaving behind the usual echo of clanking tools and the slow creak of cooling engines. Jake was alone at the far end of the bay, crouched beside a rust-bitten '67 Chevy pickup that hadn't moved in years. Its red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, and the engine under the hood looked more like a skeleton than a machine. He had the hood propped open, elbow deep in a tangle of wires and regret, when he heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. "Didn't know anyone was still here," Rachel said softly. Jake didn't turn right away, just kept working, his socket wrench moving slow and steady. "You're becoming a regular," he said. Rachel took a few cautious steps closer, her heels clicking gently on the concrete. But even in the quiet, she seemed hesitant, like she didn't want to spook something she couldn't see. "What's this one's story?" she asked, nodding toward the truck. Jake looked up, then wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. "This one." He tapped the hood. "She's been dead longer than most people been trying to keep her alive." Rachel walked around the front, eyeing the cracked windshield, the sun-bleached dash. "Yours?" "Yeah. Bought it back when I thought I'd restore it. Open a custom shop. That was a lifetime ago." "What happened?" Jake hesitated, then stood up. "Life? Bills? Then my sister got sick, and after, well, priorities changed." She ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the driver's door, careful, like she was touching something sacred. "You ever think about finishing it?" she asked. Jake looked at her, really looked. The light caught her face just right. There was a tiredness in her eyes, but also something else, a spark of curiosity, maybe even hope. "Every day," he said, "but wanting something doesn't always mean you get the time to chase it." Rachel nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the rusted hood. "Maybe some things are worth finding time for," she murmured. Jake wasn't sure if she meant the truck or something else entirely, but the words settled deep, like they belonged there. Like maybe she did too. The wind had picked up by the time they stepped outside the garage, dusk pressing low and cool against the skin. Jake handed Rachel a mug of coffee, the kind he brewed too strong, and poured into chipped ceramic that had seen better years. She took it without complaint, warming her hands against it as they sat on a stack of old tires just outside the bay door, watching the last streaks of daylight bleed into gray. For a while they didn't speak. The silence was easier than it should have been. Jake sipped from his own mug, eyes fixed on the gravel lot. Rachel kept her gaze on the horizon, like she was waiting for something to appear just past the tree line. He was the one who broke it. "You don't strike me as someone who just decided to go sightseeing in a town like this." She let out a small breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "That obvious?" He shrugged. "Little bit?" She didn't answer right away, just pulled her coat tighter around her, shoulders tense under the wool. Then quietly she said, "I got tired." Jake glanced at her, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes stayed on the fading sky. "I spent the last 6 years building something that everyone else said was important. Corner offices, strategy meetings, everything I thought I wanted. And then one day, I woke up and realized I hadn't smiled in months. Real smiles. The kind that don't come with strings attached." Jake waited, letting the words settle. "I lost a marriage along the way." He said I was married to my work. Maybe he was right. She paused. "I didn't even cry when we signed the papers, just went back to work the next morning like nothing had happened." There was no bitterness in her voice, just quiet exhaustion. "After a while, I couldn't hear myself think anymore. The noise got so loud, I figured if I didn't get out I was going to disappear." She finally turned to look at him. "So I left. No plan, no map. Just needed somewhere that didn't ask anything of me." Jake didn't offer advice, didn't ask what she used to do or what she was running from. He just nodded. "Some places don't need a reason to be the right ones," he said. Rachel looked down at her mug. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just stalling before I go back." Jake didn't say it out loud, but something in him hoped she wouldn't. Jake wasn't expecting anyone when he rolled up to the garage that morning. The sky was still pink at the edges, the kind of soft light that made everything feel quieter than it really was. He had a thermos of black coffee in one hand, keys in the other, when he spotted the delivery truck parked outside the bay. At first he thought it was a mistake, wrong address, wrong part of town, but then he saw her. Rachel stood near the open bay door, arms crossed over her chest, her hair tied back in a loose knot, wearing that same coat, now dusted with the morning chill. She was talking to the delivery guy, pointing toward the truck, nodding. There was a clipboard in his hand, boxes stacked on a dolly, her name on the shipping label. Jake froze for half a second, just long enough for Rachel to turn and catch him watching. "Morning," she said, like this was normal, like this was something people just did. He walked up slowly, gaze drifting over the boxes, brake lines, fuel pump, carburetor rebuild kit, Chevy parts, all for a 1967 truck that hadn't seen the road in over a decade. "What's this?" he asked, voice low. She signed the clipboard and handed it back to the driver. Only when the truck pulled away did she answer. "I figured if you're going to keep making excuses not to fix that thing, someone should do something about it." Jake stared at her. "Rachel." "You said you've been trying for years," she interrupted. Not with sharpness, but something else. Hesitation, soft urgency. "I thought maybe it wasn't about time. Maybe it was about having a reason to start." His jaw clenched. Not out of anger, just the kind of emotion that didn't know where to land. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "That's why I did." For a long beat they stood there, surrounded by cardboard boxes and half-spoken feelings. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, unsure what to say. Rachel folded her arms again, suddenly uncertain. If it was out of line, it wasn't, Jake cut in. It just caught me off guard. And it had. No one had ever invested in something he hadn't even finished believing in himself. But now, those parts were here. The truck was still there. And so was she. The rain had let up, leaving behind a film of steam rising from the asphalt and the thick smell of oil hanging in the air. Jake was under the hood of a customer's Impala, elbow-deep in a stubborn radiator hose, when he heard the familiar squeal of tires crunching gravel. A minute later, the shop door creaked open and Wes strolled in, carrying a sack of burgers and 2 cold sodas dripping with condensation. Jake looked up, wiping his hands on a towel. "You're late?" Wes shrugged, dropping the bag on the counter. Had to wait for Dottie to quit talking my ear off. Swear that woman's been the town crier since '88. Jake chuckled and popped the hood closed. Appreciated anyway. They ate standing by the workbench in the quiet that comes from knowing someone long enough that silence feels like conversation. Wes cracked open his soda and glanced out the open bay door. Across the street, Rachel stood outside Miller's Market, adjusting a canvas tote on her shoulder. "She's been around a lot lately," Wes said casually. Jake followed his gaze, but didn't answer. Wes squinted. "She got a name? Rachel?" Wes whistled low. "As in Rachel Whitmore?" Jake turned to look at him. "You know her." Wes raised his brows. "Hell, everyone in the industry knows her, or knew her. COO of Whitmore Foods. She was on magazine covers 2 years ago. The grocery chain that ate half the country? That's her." Jake's stomach tightened. The rain hadn't chilled him this much. "You sure?" he asked. "Positive. I met her once at a distribution summit in Memphis. She gave a keynote speech about sustainability and supply chain overhauls. Smart as hell. Cold, though. Like, business first. People later." Jake looked back toward the market, watching her laugh at something a cashier said as she handed over a $5 bill. "She doesn't seem cold," he muttered. Wes shrugged. "Maybe she's different now, or maybe she's hiding out." Jake didn't respond. He just stood there, gripping the edge of the workbench a little too tightly, watching the woman who wasn't just passing through, not anymore, and wondering why the hell she never told him who she really was. The sun had barely begun to set when Jake found her. Rachel was seated on the bench behind the diner, a takeout box in her lap, and a pair of sunglasses pushed up into her hair. She looked up when she saw him walking toward her, and something in her posture shifted, a stillness, like she'd been expecting this moment, maybe even bracing for it. Jake didn't bother with small talk. He stopped a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, the weight of what he'd just learned simmering beneath his skin. "Rachel Whitmore," he said. She blinked once, slowly set the box aside. "You knew," she said quietly. Not a question. "Wes recognized you. COO of Whitmore Foods, billion-dollar grocery empire. Keynotes, press features, the works." Rachel's mouth pressed into a thin line. She didn't deny it. "So you weren't just passing through," he said, voice low. Not angry, just tired. "I was," she said, meeting his eyes. "Still am, in a way." Jake exhaled through his nose, jaw working. "You could have told me." "I didn't lie," she said. "I just didn't lead with it." He scoffed. "Same difference." She stood then, brushing off her hands. "You want the truth? Fine. I stepped down 6 months ago, temporarily. A sabbatical. After the divorce, after the burnout, after waking up one day and realizing I couldn't breathe anymore. I left because I needed to remember who I was when no one was looking." Jake stared at her, searching her face. "And you figured hiding out in a town like this, letting everyone think you're just some quiet stranger, would help?" Her voice softened. "I wasn't hiding. I was trying to be seen, without the name, without the money, without the weight of who I used to be." He looked down at the gravel, then back up. "I wasn't judging you for your past. I just wish you trusted me enough to tell me." Rachel's expression cracked, just slightly. "I didn't want you to look at me and see all that. I wanted you to look at me the way you did when I dropped a bag of groceries." Jake didn't answer. But something about the way he looked at her now, not angry, not bitter, just real, said maybe he still could. Maybe he already was. The garage was quiet when Rachel stepped inside, her heels clicking gently on the concrete, though not with the same sharp confidence they used to carry. This time, her steps felt careful, measured. Jake was at his workbench, head down, sanding a piece of sheet metal for the Chevy. He didn't look up right away. "I'm not here to explain myself again," she said. Jake paused, then straightened, wiped his hands on a rag, slow and deliberate. "Good," he said, "because I heard you loud and clear the first time." Rachel nodded, lips pressed tight. Her eyes moved over the place, grease-streaked floor, cracked radio in the corner, the faded photo of Jake and Lila thumbtacked to the cabinet. You love it here, she said quietly. I don't know if love's the word, Jake replied, but it's mine. Feels honest. Rachel stepped closer, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a folded manila envelope. She held it out to him. He hesitated, took it. What's this? An idea, she said. A proposal. Jake opened it. Diagrams, budgets, projections, blueprints of custom-built electric vehicles designed for cold storage and short-range delivery. The logo at the bottom, Field and Route, a Whitmore initiative. I'm building something new, Rachel said. Smaller, smarter, local farms, community-based grocery network. I want to deliver fresh food, real food, to places like this, the kind of towns big corporations forget about unless there's profit to be made. Jake kept his eyes on the papers, but his silence invited her to keep going. I want a fleet of sustainable delivery vehicles, hybrids, maybe full electric down the lines, and I want you to lead that division. Design, maintenance, hiring, everything mechanical yours. Jake looked up slowly. Why me? She met his gaze without flinching. Because you know how to build things that last. Because you fix more than engines. Because you're the only person I trust to make sure this doesn't turn into another soulless machine. He swallowed. The weight of the offer pressed against his ribs like a steel beam. This isn't charity? No, she said. It's belief. He stared at her, then at the envelope again. The future had never looked so real, or so close. Jake set the envelope down like it was something that might catch fire if he held it too long. He didn't speak for a while, just stared at the workbench, at the grease beneath his nails, at the calluses lining his palms like proof that everything he had, he'd earned the hard way. The silence between them thickened, filling the space like smoke after an engine blowout. I don't belong in something like this, he finally muttered. Rachel didn't move. Why not? He let out a dry laugh, no humor in it. Because I fix busted engines in a half-broke garage, Rachel. I'm not a logistics guy. I've never drawn up a budget, never worn a suit, never answered to a boardroom. She stepped forward just enough to close some of the space between them. And I've worked with the guys in suits. I've sat in the boardrooms. Trust me, they don't know half of what you do. He shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. Come on, you don't really believe that. You're building a company with a name, legacy. You've got money, investors, the whole machine, and I'm just... Don't say it, she cut in sharply. Don't finish that sentence. Jake looked at her, saw the heat in her eyes. Not anger, passion. You're not just anything, she continued. You're someone who shows up when it's raining and a stranger's stuck. You're someone who raises a little girl, like she hung the moon. You're someone who fixes things even when no one's watching. That's exactly why I chose you. He swallowed hard, jaw clenched. What if I screw it up? Then we fix it, she said. That's what you do, isn't it? Jake turned away, the weight of her words pressing against something old inside him, something that had always told him to stay small, stay quiet, stay where it's safe. He didn't answer. Couldn't. Not yet. Rachel didn't push. She just watched him, eyes soft now. Hopeful. Jake stared at the blueprints one last time, then walked out of the bay into the late light of a town that had always known his name, but never asked more of him than he was willing to give. Until now. Rachel didn't come by the shop the next day, or the one after that. Jake told himself it didn't matter. He threw himself into engine rebuilds and transmission swaps, working late into the night like sweat and noise could drown out the ache sitting behind his ribs. He didn't touch the envelope she'd left on the workbench. Didn't look at the blueprint sketches or the diagrams or the note scribbled in her neat handwriting for the future, if you want it. He told Kyle to handle any walk-ins, kept the bay door half shut, didn't stop for coffee at Dottie's, just kept his head down and stayed moving, like maybe if he moved fast enough, the truth wouldn't catch up. But it did. It always did. It caught up on a rainy Tuesday, when he picked up Lila from school and she climbed into the passenger seat, holding a smudged crayon drawing in her hands. She's not coming anymore, huh? She said, folding her legs up under her. The grocery lady. Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel, eyes locked on the road. Lila kept going. Did something bad happen? Did you say something mean, or did she have to leave like Mama did? Jake's jaw clenched. That's enough, Lila. But I liked her. She liked my pictures. She made you smile. I said that's enough. The words came out louder than he meant, sharp like a snapped belt under pressure. Lila shrank back into the seat, her eyes wide, blinking fast. She didn't say another word the whole ride home. By the time they got to the trailer, the silence was worse than anything else. Jake cut the engine, stared out through the windshield as the wipers dragged across the glass. Rain ticked gently on the roof. He could hear her quiet sniffle beside him. He exhaled, leaned his head against the steering wheel. "Hey," he said softly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to yell." Lila didn't look at him, just nodded. Jake turned toward her, his voice rough now. "I miss her too, kiddo." Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, Jake sat in the stillness he couldn't fix. Not with tools, not with effort, not this time. The letter came on a Wednesday morning, tucked in a plain white envelope, with his name written across the front in neat, slanted handwriting. No logo, no business header, just Jake, nothing more. He found it on the workbench when he opened the garage, right where he usually dropped his thermos. At first, he thought it might be from a customer, maybe a complaint or a thank you note. But as soon as he picked it up, he knew. The weight of it felt different. So did the quiet. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. "Jake, I'm not writing to convince you. Not about the job, not about the project, not about anything. I just wanted to say thank you. You didn't know who I was when you helped me, and you didn't care. You didn't ask questions, didn't expect anything. You just saw someone stuck and did something about it. That kind of kindness doesn't come with a title. It comes from who you are when no one's looking. I came here trying to remember what that felt like, honesty without strings. And for a little while, I did. You reminded me what it means to build something with your hands, to show up every day for someone who needs you. Watching you with Lila, it made me wish I'd met people like you earlier in my life. Maybe I would have made different choices. I'm leaving town tomorrow. I won't say goodbye, just this. If you ever want to try something new, something different, I'll be wherever that road takes you. And if not, that's okay too. You've already given me more than you realize. Take care of that little girl, and don't let that old truck stay a ghost forever." Rachel Jake didn't move for a long time, just stood there, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. He read it again. Then a third time, slower. There was no ask, no deal, no polished hook. Just her voice on the page, steady, clear, real. And in the middle of that grease-stained garage, Jake Carter realized what it felt like when someone saw all of you and didn't look away. The nights grew longer after she left. Jake stopped checking the diner, stopped looking across the street when the doorbell rang at the garage. But something in him didn't settle. It just shifted, moved deeper, like a splinter you can't reach but feel every time you grip something too tight. The envelope with Rachel's blueprints stayed on his bench for 3 days, untouched, until the silence got too loud to ignore. It was almost midnight when Jake rolled the shop's side door open and wheeled in the old service van that had been sitting half forgotten behind the shop since spring. Battery dead, tires soft. A cracked windshield that made it damn near impossible to see through in the rain. He didn't tell anyone, not Kyle, not Wes, not even Lila. He just started working, slow at first, telling himself it didn't mean anything, just a little tinkering, just to see if the specs made sense, just to check if the suspension could handle the weight Rachel had projected, just a mechanic's curiosity. But hours passed, then nights. He stayed late after everyone else had gone home, the glow of the hanging bulb casting shadows across his face as he traced wiring diagrams, flipped through notes, and adjusted torque specs until his hands cramped. He pulled out the rusted compressor unit, replaced the brake line, tore out the gut of the van's tired engine, and set it beside a crate of new parts he bought on credit, telling himself he'd figure the money out later. It wasn't about the job anymore. It was about the look in Rachel's eyes when she handed him the envelope. The way she talked about feeding forgotten towns, the way she saw something in him, something he wasn't sure had survived the last few years of hard days and long nights. By the fifth night, he stood over the van, covered in sweat and grease, heart thudding louder than the silence. He still didn't know if he believed in the future she imagined, but he was starting to believe in the part of himself that wanted to try. The morning started like any other. Sun slicing through the clouds, coffee too bitter, and the usual clang of tools echoing through the garage. Jake was elbow-deep in a timing belt replacement when Kyle walked in with a bag of breakfast sandwiches and that look he wore when he had something to say he knew Jake wouldn't like. "You hear about Rachel?" Kyle asked, unwrapping his food slowly. Jake didn't look up. "What about her?" "She's gone. Left town a couple days ago." Jake's hand stilled on the ratchet. "Gone where?" "Back to the city, far as I heard. Wes ran into one of the delivery guys she used for that parts shipment. Said she packed up, told them it didn't work out, that she gave it one last try." Jake tightened the bolt harder than necessary, his jaw clenched. One last try. The words sat wrong in his chest, like rust in a clean line. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a towel that already looked like it had lived through a war. His gaze drifted toward the road outside, the one she used to cross in that long coat and clean boots, like she didn't belong here but somehow fit anyway. He hadn't realized how often he had been listening for her voice, half expecting it to carry in with the wind when the door creaked open. Hadn't realized just how much space she'd carved out, quietly, without force, into the routine of his life. And now she was just gone. Back to the place with the boardrooms and deadlines, the city that chewed people up and called it progress. He told himself, didn't matter. She made a choice, took her name, her title, her future, and walked. But the garage felt bigger now, too big, and too quiet. Jake looked down at the van in the corner, half finished, half forgotten, and felt a hollowness settle in his chest, not because she'd left, but because he hadn't stopped her. The engine coughed once, then again, a deep metallic rumble echoing through the garage like a heart remembering how to beat. Jake leaned over the wheel, hand steady on the key, every muscle in his arms tensed. And then, like a breath held too long finally let go, the truck roared to life. The sound wasn't perfect. The idle was rough, and the exhaust let out a throatier growl than he remembered from the day he bought it. But it was alive. After all the years it sat there gathering dust and doubt, though 67 Chevy finally breathed again. Jake didn't smile. Not at first. He just stared at the dash, listening to the thrum of the engine like it might vanish if he blinked too hard. Outside, the wind tugged at the trees. Inside, something shifted in his chest. He slid off the stool and walked to the trailer, boots tracking grease across the porch. Lila was at the table, coloring, head bent over a half-finished drawing of a dragon with pink wings. "Come on," he said, grabbing the keys off the hook. "We're going for a ride." She looked up, eyes lighting with curiosity. "In what?" Jake only held up the key and gave a rare grin. 5 minutes later, they were bouncing down the back road behind the shop, the gravel kicking up behind the tires like dust off old memories. The engine roared as Jake shifted into third, and Lila whooped beside him, arms thrown up like she was on a roller coaster. "This thing is loud," she yelled over the noise. "She's not used to being quiet," Jake called back, a chuckle slipping out without effort. They rode in silence for a while after that, windows down, the wind knotting Lila's hair and whipping past Jake's face like it was trying to scrape away whatever weight still lingered in his chest. Then, soft as a confession, Lila said, "I miss her too." Jake's hands tightened on the wheel, but he didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The words landed in the space between them like truth always does, gentle and heavy. He nodded once, the engine humming beneath them. "Yeah," he said, "me too." The sound of the shop door locking echoed louder than it should have. Jake stood there for a second, key still in the lock, hand hovering, like the finality of it might crack him open if he moved too fast. He looked around the garage, the scarred floors, the crooked workbench, the shelves stacked with old parts and new problems. This place had been his whole world for so long, a fortress of routines and grease-stained certainty. It had kept him safe. It had kept him small. Lila stood behind him, backpack slung over one shoulder, her dragon drawing folded carefully in her front pocket. "Are we really going?" Jake turned and looked at her. There wasn't an ounce of doubt in her eyes, just the same quiet faith she always carried, the kind he didn't think he deserved, but clung to anyway. "Yeah," he said, "we're going." He loaded her into the truck, the same one Rachel had helped bring back to life with those parts she ordered without asking. The same one he'd spent years saying he'd fix someday. Someday had always been the excuse, the delay, the shield. But not today. Today, fear didn't get a vote. The engine grumbled to life, and he pulled onto the open road, watching the town fade in the rearview mirror, like something already beginning to belong to the past. The diner, the market, the crooked sign for Whitlow Auto Repair, they all blurred into a wash of memory. Lila leaned her head against the window, eyes following the power lines stretching out across the fields. "Do you think she'll be happy to see us?" she asked. Jake didn't answer right away. His throat was tight, and the city skyline still miles ahead, but deep down he knew Rachel had left to protect what she built. He was heading there now to help her carry it. "I think," he said slowly, "she's been waiting for us to catch up." They didn't need a perfect plan, just a decision. And he'd finally made one. He was done standing still. The city hit different after so many years away, louder, tighter. Buildings scraped the sky like they had something to prove. But Jake didn't flinch behind the wheel, didn't let the honking horns or the impatient stares rattle him. Lila sat beside him in the passenger seat, her face pressed to the window, eyes wide with wonder and nerves. He pulled up to the address scrawled on the folder Rachel had left tucked behind her letter. It was a corner lot, once an old hardware store, now wrapped in scaffolding and promise. The words Field and Route were painted in bold green across the new sign, not quite finished, but already proud. Jake parked, killed the engine, and stepped out. He didn't hesitate. Inside, workers buzzed around the polished concrete floor, unpacking crates, wiring the checkout counters, placing displays. It was coming together fast. The kind of fast that said someone had poured everything into it and needed it to work, needed it to mean something. He spotted her before she saw him. Rachel, standing near the center of the store with a clipboard in one hand and a cell phone pressed to her ear. Her hair was up, glasses perched on her nose, blazer sleeves rolled to her elbows. She looked focused, tired, and beautiful in a way that made his throat tighten. Then she turned, and everything stopped. She blinked once, twice, like her mind needed a second to catch up to what her heart already recognized. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Jake walked toward her, slow and steady, like a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to say. He stopped in front of her, holding out the rolled blueprints he'd carried from the truck. "I believe this is where I come in," he said. Rachel stared at him, her chest rising and falling like she'd been holding her breath since the moment she left. "I didn't think you'd come," she whispered. "I almost didn't," he replied, "but I'm tired of almost." Her fingers brushed his as she took the plans from him, and something in both of them settled. They had arrived. They stood in the middle of the unfinished store, surrounded by open boxes, bare shelves, and the faint smell of fresh paint and sawdust. Rachel still hadn't moved, not much anyway. She held the blueprints like they were something delicate, almost fragile, and her eyes stayed on Jake like she was afraid he might vanish if she blinked too long. He took a breath, not to calm himself, but to make sure what he said next came out the way he meant it. "I'll help you build this," he said, voice steady. "I'll give you everything I've got. Tools, hands, time, whatever you need." Rachel's lips parted, but Jake didn't let her speak yet. "But I'm not just here for the job." Her brow creased. She lowered the blueprints slowly. I came because I couldn't keep pretending it didn't matter that you left. Couldn't pretend it didn't hurt when you walked away without giving me a say. You don't get to show up, drop a future in my lap, then run because it scared you." She looked away, guilt flickering across her face. Jake stepped closer, not to corner her, but to make sure she heard him clearly. "I know what it's like to bury yourself in work so you don't have to feel what's missing. I've been doing it for years. But Rachel, this thing you're building, it's not just a store, it's you starting over. And you don't have to do that alone." Rachel looked at him then, really looked, like he was something she'd been trying not to want but couldn't unsee anymore. "I don't know how to do this," she said, her voice small, honest. Jake nodded. "Neither do I. But we figure it out, that's the deal." He took one more step forward. "I'll help you build it, all of it, but only if you stop running from what you want." He held her gaze. "Including me." Rachel didn't answer right away, but she didn't walk away this time, and maybe that was her answer. Rachel's breath hitched before she could stop it. One hand still clutched the edge of the blueprint roll like it was something to hold her steady. But her shoulders were beginning to shake, her eyes wide and blinking too fast. Jake didn't move, didn't press, didn't crowd her. He just stood there, giving her space and silence, the kind of silence that made it safe to unravel. Then she laughed. It burst out of her suddenly, sharp and brittle, like the sound had been stuck in her chest for years and didn't know how to come out gently. "I'm sorry," she said, covering her mouth. "God, I sound insane." Jakey shook his head. "You sound like someone who's been holding it in for too damn long." She lowered her hand, the laugh already fading. Her lips trembled. And just like that, the tears came. Not in waves, just quietly. One drop at a time, sliding down her cheeks as if they'd always meant to fall but never got the chance. She didn't hide it. She didn't wipe them away. "I didn't think I'd ever get here," she whispered. "Not just this store. I mean, this. You. Lila. A chance to start over. Somewhere that didn't expect me to wear armor every day." Jake's throat tightened, but he didn't look away. "I spent so many years proving I was strong enough, smart enough, tough enough. And then when everything finally cracked, when I left, I thought maybe that was it. Maybe I'd run out of chances." He stepped closer, slow and steady, until he was right in front of her. He took the blueprint from her hands and set it gently on the nearest crate. Then he reached up, brushed a tear from her cheek with the side of his thumb. "You never had to earn it, Rachel," he said softly. "You just had to stop pretending you didn't deserve it." Her eyes met his, wet and searching. She leaned into him then, not out of weakness, but as someone finally choosing to be held. And Jake wrapped his arms around her like he'd been waiting to do it all his life. The old hardware store on the edge of town didn't look like it used to anymore. The faded letters were gone, the boarded windows replaced with clean glass that reflected the soft gold of the morning sun. Inside shelves held produce from nearby farms. The air carried the scent of roasted coffee and fresh pine wood. And tucked off to the side, through a wide garage door framed in brushed steel, sat the heart of the operation. Jake's new shop. He moved through it like he'd always belonged there, clipboard in hand, grease on his shirt, and a pencil behind his ear. Around him, a small team of mechanics buzzed with quiet energy, their work purposeful. They didn't rush, didn't bark orders. They trusted the rhythm Jake had taught them. Steady, thoughtful, exact. A prototype electric van sat on a lift, half disassembled, while a younger guy named Mason checked diagnostics on a tablet. Jake leaned over the side, peering at the suspension with the practiced eye of a man who didn't miss much. "Feels off-center," he muttered. "By about 2 degrees, Mason confirmed. Jake nodded, tapping the wrench twice against the frame. "Let's reset the bracket. Start clean." Outside, Lila's bright purple bike leaned against the front window. She always parked it crooked, one tire halfway in the flower bed Rachel had insisted on planting. No one ever moved it. It had become a kind of fixture, like a flag for the life they'd built here. Inside the store, Rachel was giving a tour to a group of potential investors. Nothing flashy, just thoughtful explanation, confident steps. But when she passed the wide window looking into the garage, her eyes flicked to Jake. He didn't look up, didn't need to. They moved in tandem now, even when apart. Later, when the lunch rush settled and the shop grew quiet, Rachel walked in holding 2 sandwiches in wax paper. Jake was wiping his hands on a rag. "Don't suppose you remembered to eat," she said. He smiled, small and familiar. "Didn't have to. You always do." And in the background, the hum of a life not perfect, but finally, undeniably theirs. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and garlic, the scent thick in the air as steam curled from the skillet on the stove. Jake stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, carefully slicing into a roasted chicken while Rachel stirred something in a saucepan with precise, practiced movements. It was quiet, save for the soft sizzle of oil and the occasional scrape of metal against ceramic. But it wasn't awkward. Not anymore. It was the kind of quiet that felt earned, comfortable, like neither of them needed to fill the space with words just to prove something. "Is that the right knife?" Rachel asked, glancing over her shoulder, eyebrow raised. Jake looked down at the blade in his hand, then back at her. "It's sharp, it works." She smirked. "It's a bread knife." He shrugged. "Still works." She laughed softly and returned to the sauce, shaking her head. "You're impossible. And you're bossy. You love it." He didn't argue, just looked at her for a beat too long before returning to the chicken, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. She moved like someone who'd once had every second of her life scheduled down to the minute, precise, quick, intentional. He moved slower, more deliberate, like every action had its own rhythm that couldn't be rushed. But somehow they didn't clash. They just fit. By the time the plates hit the table, Lila was already curled up on the couch with a book, her voice drifting in every now and then to ask if she had to eat the green stuff. Rachel rolled her eyes. Jake smuggled her an extra piece of bread behind Rachel's back. They ate side by side, mismatched forks and cloth napkins that didn't match anything else in the house. Rachel had brought the wine. Jake had made sweet tea. 2 worlds, 1 table. Between bites, she rested her hand on his knee under the table. He didn't say anything, just reached down, fingers curling around hers like they'd always belonged there. This wasn't the life Rachel had planned. It was better, it was slower, messier, quieter, and it was exactly what she never knew she needed. The morning was crisp, sunlight pouring through the garage's wide doors and casting golden streaks across the concrete. Jake was beneath the hood of one of the delivery vans, elbow-deep in wiring, when he heard the sound of soft footsteps behind him. Heels, but not the sharp, fast kind from when they'd first met. These were slower now, more grounded. He wiped his hands on a rag and turned. Rachel stood there holding a canvas bag, the corners a little frayed, the handles wrinkled from time and use. The print on it was faint but familiar, a faded green logo half washed away, the shape of a fruit basket that once belonged to the old miller's market. She didn't say anything at first. Just held it out to him, her eyes soft and bright, in that way they got when she wasn't overthinking, when she wasn't guarding. Jake took the bag, turning it over in his hands. It was light, but he could tell it carried more than groceries. "I kept it," Rachel said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, like the moment would shatter if she spoke too loud. "It's the same one from the parking lot, the day everything fell out. You bent down without a word and helped me gather it all like it wasn't the end of the world." Jake looked at her. "You looked like you thought it was." She laughed under her breath, then stepped a little closer. "I didn't know it then," she said. "But that was the moment something started. Something I wasn't ready for, didn't believe I deserved. And now—" She gestured toward the bag. "It's the best broken thing that ever happened to me." Jake ran his fingers along the edge of the fabric, remembering how she'd looked standing there, flustered, winded, trying to hold it together while oranges rolled across the asphalt. He hadn't seen a CEO that day. just a woman whose hands were too full and heart too heavy. He set the bag down gently, then pulled her into him, wrapping his arms around her like a promise. She melted into him, and neither of them had to say what they already knew. Sometimes life breaks wide open just to let something better in. The photo was tucked between a pile of invoices and a coffee-stained shop manual, creases soft at the corners, the colors a little faded. Jake found it by accident, flipping through a drawer, looking for a missing wrench socket. He paused when he saw it, like time caught him mid-motion. It was from the county fair, taken months ago. Someone had snapped it while the three of them were standing near the Ferris wheel, cotton candy in Lila's hand, Jake's flannel sleeves rolled to the elbows, and Rachel, laughing at something out of frame, her head tilted toward him. There was dust on Jake's jeans and grease under his fingernails even then, but his smile was easy, unguarded, real. He stared at it for a long while. Later that afternoon, when the sun dipped low and the garage emptied out, he slid the photo into a frame he'd had, sitting on a forgotten shelf. It was an old one, cracked wood, some dents in the metal edges. But it held. He wiped the glass clean and set it on the counter near the register where anyone walking in could see it. Not to show off, just to remember. Rachel came in just after sunset, holding 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag of pastries from the shop across the street. She handed one to Jake, then caught sight of the frame. Her breath hitched slightly. "You kept that?" He didn't look up as he took the cup. "Found it today. Figured it deserved a spot." Rachel stepped closer, brushing her fingers over the edge of the frame. Her smile was soft, quiet, the kind that carried the weight of everything they'd walked through to get here. Lila ran in from the office, sneakers squeaking on the concrete, stopping short when she saw them both standing there. Her eyes landed on the photo. "I remember that day," she said, her voice full of something fragile and warm. "That was the first time it felt like we were a real family." Jake crouched beside her, pulling her in with one arm. "We are." Lila looked up at the photo again, then at both of them. "We're not broken anymore," she said. "We just needed each other." And for once, none of them had anything left to add. They didn't need to.